As Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, secret peace talks were held between both Ukraine and Russia. Meeting first in Belarus, then remotely, then finally in Istanbul, they clamored for a peaceful and swift end to the war. Huge gaps existed between them though, and as the battlefield situation worsened for Russia, the diplomatic situation worsened as well. And this has led to some key lies about what happened. We're going to talk about what happened. Both sides have made claims about these negotiations. From Russian claims that the retreat from Kiev was a good faith retreat for the peace negotiations, to the Ukrainian claims that Russia was operating in poor faith. All this coming to light in an article from the New York Times, which got access to the drafts of these ceasefire agreements and reported on them in June. There's a link to this report down in the video description as well for your own reading. On February 24th, 2022, Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That same day, Ukrainian and Russian officials also began to meet to negotiate an end to the fighting. These meetings were held in secret, first with the Ukrainian officials meeting a Russian delegation in Belarus. On the table were several key issues: Ukrainian neutrality, the status of Crimea, Donbass, and the other newly occupied areas of Ukraine, the size and composition of the Ukrainian military after the war, and a number of laws within the Ukrainian constitution, as well as the status of Ukrainian neutrality and ability to join other alliance organizations. Specifically, Russia wanted to retain control of what it had already captured, but most importantly, control over Crimea and the Donbass. They also wanted Ukraine to commit to never joining NATO, keeping its military at a specific and small size, and to institute Russian as an official state language. Ukraine, on the other hand, was willing to make some concessions. For instance, it was willing to cede Crimea and parts of the Donbass, as long as it didn't have to recognize Russian sovereignty over those areas. Ukraine would also be willing to not join NATO. However, it wanted some guarantee of security in the form of other partner states. And this is where things get particularly interesting. Whereas in the Budapest Memorandum, Ukrainian security would be guaranteed and defended by both the United States and Russia, this agreement would see even more states involved. Potential partners include the United States, Russia, Poland, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, and Israel. If any country, like say Russia, were to attack Ukraine, then those partner countries would be treaty bound to intervene. There were still large gaps between both Russia and Ukraine in these negotiations though, specifically around those security partners and the size of the Ukrainian military. There were also considerable concerns from Ukraine's allies about the terms of this agreement. For instance, the New York Times reported that the Polish president stood with a draft of the agreement in March 2022 at a NATO summit and asked if anyone there would be willing to accept these terms for their own countries. Nobody responded. The terms would see Ukraine's military heavily capped in size and capability. Not only would there be heavy limits placed on the amount of troops and equipment that they could have, there would be limits on the range that their missiles could have. Ukraine would leave the door open to these demands, however they wanted to have enough range and capabilities to still target Russian troops in Crimea and defend against another invasion if needed. After works of further negotiation remotely, the two sides met again in Istanbul in April 2022. Russian forces had been slowed to a stop across northern Ukraine, with Ukrainian troops retaking parts of Sumy Oblast and areas northwest of Kiev, namely the suburb of Kiev, Irpin. This is when Russia would make a claim that has been all over my comments anytime I mention that Russia was forced to retreat from Kiev. Putin would make a claim to withdraw some forces around Kiev and to slow operations in northern Ukraine as a goodwill gesture for the negotiations in Istanbul. Of course, even if Russia wanted to stay and fight longer, they would be facing significant challenges. Ukraine had the initiative, Russian logistics had broken down, and Russian forces around Kiev were quickly running out of food, fuel, and ammo. Goodwill or not, Russia faced significant risks if it decided not to retreat. This all happened as Ukrainian and Russian officials met in Istanbul to further hash out a ceasefire deal. And thus the narrative was developed that Russia withdrew from Kiev as a goodwill gesture for the Istanbul negotiations. You can come to your own conclusion on whether or not that is in fact true, or if that was the result of battlefield realities and it just so happened that the Istanbul negotiations were happening at the same time. It was in Istanbul where the negotiations would finally break down. These talks more specifically broke down on the topic of security guarantors. Like I mentioned before, Ukraine wanted multiple European partners as well as the United States to help guarantee its own security in the event that it was attacked. When the draft of this agreement was sent to Putin's desk, a line had been inserted by the Russian delegation that Ukraine had not agreed to, saying that Russia had veto power over the types of intervention that could happen whenever a security violation happened. Once the Ukrainian delegation received this demand from the Russian side, they ceased negotiation with Russia. And that takes us to where we are now, over 2 years later, with hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides killed and wounded, and with no end in sight. So were these negotiations even real, or were they in bad faith as Ukraine has asserted? Certainly the way that the negotiations have ended is not a good look for Russia. It's asinine to think that a country like Russia, who is the aggressor in this war and would likely be the aggressor in the next one, would have veto power over any kind of intervention from the other kinds of security guarantors for Ukraine. This is exactly what the Ukrainians thought as well, and why they decided that they were going nowhere. Since the negotiations broke down, Russia has held to its position that they had in Istanbul as their goals for this conflict. Granted, they've also held that their ultimate goal is a change in leadership in Kiev, with the familiar face, Viktor Yanukovych, as the potential replacement for Zelensky. However, for now, Russia's claimed goals in Ukraine are to secure the 4 oblasts it has invaded, that being Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. However, they want these oblasts in full, meaning in their administrative borders and not what's occupied today. With Ukrainian troops defending parts of these oblasts, it would require either a defeat of those forces or a negotiated withdrawal of those troops, again from Ukrainian territory, for Russia to get this demand. Russia also wants Ukraine to remain a neutral country, meaning no NATO membership. And today, Ukraine is even more hell-bent than ever on joining NATO, and the language coming from the NATO summit in Washington around the time of this recording indicate that that is even more realistic than ever as well. Ukraine, however, wants a full withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, with Crimea being really the only exception, but with an asterisk. Ukraine won't accept Russian sovereignty over Crimea or any other occupied area of Ukraine, meaning Ukraine can still identify Crimea as an occupied territory. This point alone is what marked the largest difference between Russia and Ukraine in their negotiations in 2022 as well as today. Putin has proposed new peace talks, however beforehand Ukraine would have to withdraw from these 4 oblasts that Russia claims. This is obviously not going to happen unless the battlefield realities force Ukraine into a retreat. And as of the time of this recording in mid-July of 2024, it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. Both Russia and Ukraine have proposed peace talks, however both have not invited each other to those talks, meaning in reality these summits, like what Ukraine is hosting in Switzerland, are really just a space to prepare and refine peace proposals before they're actually sent to the other side and negotiated over. China has also attempted to play a role in facilitating peace talks, however their proposal, which you can view online, is fairly boilerplate. One of the key requirements for China's proposal is a requirement that Russia has today with their peace proposal, and that they really hammered during their negotiations in 2022, and that is the full withdrawal of Western sanctions that have been in place since 2014. And from the American perspective, that's just not going to happen unless Russia were to withdraw from Crimea and the Donbass. Instead, what we're left with is what Clausewitz refers to as politics by other means. That is to say, war. They're just going to have to fight it out and let the battlefield decide until either side gets to a point where it's willing to negotiate again. Now, with all that, I want to hear what you think about all of this. Do check out the links down in the description. Those are some of the sources that I've used for this. They go into much greater detail, not only in the talks in 2022, but also kind of where that narrative came from with the withdrawal from Kiev. I think it's kind of interesting to look at this. I've seen a lot of this in my video comments, so I wanted to make a video kind of diving into this because it's interesting. It happened, a couple years ago, so it can be easy to kind of forget what happened. But also at the same time, I think it's important to kind of debunk what was going on because, it's important to remember the context of what's going on when these negotiations were happening with what's going on in the battlefield, but also to kind of recognize that what's going on in the battlefield is not really necessarily informed by what's going on in the diplomatic space, at least not all the time. So comment your thoughts down below. Let's continue this discussion. Leave a like to help this video hit new audiences so that way we can enrich the conversation down in the comments, and subscribe for more content on this conflict and others, as well as more analysis on international relations and defense. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.